They also carried war clubs and flint knives. By the 18th century, the Apaches get firearms, guns from the Spanish, and become expert marksmen. But rifles are very rare with the Apache at this point. Only during the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s, during the Apache Wars for Survival, did rifles become standard issue for Apache warriors. Now, for almost 3 centuries, almost 300 years, the history of the Apache was an almost uninterrupted succession of bitter, relentless battles against the white settlers. Almost from the first moment of contact with the Spaniards in the 16th century, the Apaches would remain equally hostile towards the Mexicans and Americans until the end of the 19th century. Through the Civil War and up to the early 1880s, the Apaches, led by chiefs like Cochise and Mangus Coloradas, basically resisted confinement and intrusion into their territory. More than anything else, it was probably the incessant kidnapping and enslavement of Apache women and children that gave the Apaches their, rather mad dog enmity towards the whites. It is estimated that as many as 6,000 Apache Indian slaves were held by the white people of New Mexico and Arizona, with thousands more enslaved Apaches held against their will in Mexico. Now, the prostitution of captured Apache women during the 1860s up until the 1890s, really, troubled the Apaches exceedingly. It was during this horrible period that the Apaches are supposed to have taken to the custom of mutilating their dead enemies. This practice is linked directly to Apache spiritual beliefs. For the Apaches believed that a person traveled in the afterlife in the physical state in which he or she died. For example, cutting off the head of a dead enemy was the ultimate mutilation. For the person or victim would then wander headless through eternity. Now, during the 1870s, the Apaches were forced onto reservations. By the late 1870s, the government attempted to consolidate the various Apache bands into one big reservation. Some of the Apaches fled to the hills, others fled south into Mexico. Of course, the most elusive and most famous of all the Apache freedom fighters was Geronimo, who did not surrender until September 1886. The Apaches were then deported as prisoners of war to Florida and later sent to Alabama. After much hardship and death by disease, the remaining Apaches settled in Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Geronimo, who was at this time had become Christianized, but is world famous and considered a living legend at this time, so much so that he is taken under guard to the St. Louis World's Fair, where Geronimo sells pictures of himself to delighted tourists for 25 cents each. The Chiricahua Apaches of the Southwest are perhaps the best well-known of all the Apache peoples and have the strongest cultural identity. The Chiricahua are linked or intertwined culturally with the Chihene, the Badonkahe, the Nedhai, and the Chokonan peoples. The name Chiricahua means mountain people and or people of the sun. And the term Chiricahua is linked to the twisted canyons and craggy summits of the Sierra Mountains. The Sierras, of course, would become a type of ultimate sanctuary for these Apaches during the wars of the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s. Now let's get a little bit into the religion of these mountain Apaches, which was polytheistic and animistic. Their supreme god, Usen, was a supernatural power whose existence predated the creation of the universe. Now, there's important intermediaries in the Apache religion. White painted woman and child of the water. There are many variant myths and legends in which one or the other was responsible for creating the earth. Now, all the myths and legends agree that the child of the water created the Apache people. His brother, the killer of enemies, who freed the game animals from their underground home, also created the white man. Now, the most important ceremony or ritual in Chiricahua Apache spiritual life was the girls' puberty ritual, which lasted 4 days and nights and included, prayers, feasting, and dancing. During the puberty ritual/ceremony, Apache men wore masks. These masks represented the Ga'an, the mountain gods. The Ga'an were benevolent deities that protected the Chiricahua people from harm and evil. Unlike other Indian tribes, the Apaches did not believe that a few exceptional individuals like shamans or medicine men possessed all the spiritual power. To the Apache, almost any man or woman could have power of one kind or another. Power, spiritual power, could not be sought by any individual. It could only come to a person unbidden. This power could only come in a dream or a vision. This dream or vision being a type of supernatural gift that is given to a chosen person. The Apache religion, their spiritual life, was somewhat bewildered by the white man's endless or lust for gold. They were certainly dismayed by this lust for gold. Gold to the Apache was considered too soft a metal to actually be useful. But more importantly, gold was sacred to their god, Usain. Gold to the Apache was a symbol of the sun, and they had a taboo against mining this precious and sacred metal. Apaches could pick it up off the ground, could pick it up off the surface of Mother Earth, but could not dig in the ground for it. For to do so would incur the supernatural wrath of their god Usain. The mountain gods, if you started mining for gold, would dance fiercely and shake their mighty shoulders and destroy everything and everyone that happened to be nearby. Lightning also played a major role in the Apache religion, and lightning was considered to be a visible manifestation of powerful supernatural beings known as the Thunder People. The Thunder People had once hunted on behalf of the Apaches, supplying all their game meat as needed. Flashes of lightning were the arrows of the Thunder People, and the chipped flints of stone that are found all over the Southwest were considered to be the remnants of these sacred arrows. But at some point during the Apache past, the Apache people took the Thunder People's hunting for granted, and their ingratitude was punished, and the Thunder People withdrew their supernatural aid or assistance. Lightning was considered a profoundly ambiguous power, and the Apache would fend off the danger of being struck by it by using charms and totems. When lightning split open the sky, the Apaches would wear sage in their hair and make sure that nothing red was near their persons. They did not eat during a lightning storm and uttered a spitting noise in order to show the lightning respect. Lightning strikes nearby were considered to be a pungent power in the air. If a person inhaled this pungent power, he or she could fall sick from the lightning sickness or illness. Lightning was also considered to be a force for good, and Apaches often prayed to it with a special class of shamans who specialized in lightning phenomena. For example, the presence of iron tended to negate this shaman's power, this lightning specialist's power. The Apaches also had a strong belief in witchcraft and sorcery. A suspected witch, or brujo, was suspended between two trees with ropes tied around his wrists and legs. basically 3 feet off the ground. A fire was then kindled beneath them till the flames reached their flesh, and the suspected witch or brujo was then burnt alive. The body was then hacked to pieces, and the pieces then burnt upon the fire, and the ashes scattered to the winds. This ritual was not meant to be sadistic, but was considered a necessary procedure for dealing with evil that had been loosed upon the world. It was a way to appropriate the Great Spirit and the manifestation of his wrath upon this evil. This belief, this Apache belief in witchcraft, was so strong or pervasive that many other Indian tribes considered all Apaches witches or brujos and feared their dark spiritual powers. All right, with that thought, we're going to take another musical break. When we return, I'm going to recite 2 Apache myths, a Genesis story from the Hikarias Apaches, also known as the Athabascan peoples of southern New Mexico, and a multicultural Apache myth about how the curing ceremonies and rituals came into being. But first, some more music. This is the late, great Jimi Hendrix, the guitar god himself, who is of Cherokee origin, with the classic Midnight Lightning. Stay with us. This is God Rock Radio.